My name is Celeste. I'm 29, born beneath the heavy shadow of a last name I never fully wore, raised in a house that glittered from the outside, while the inside remained a mausoleum of silence and shame. They called me a princess, but never let me touch the crown. At every party, I stood at the edges, holding up the pillars with my presence, never invited into the center of the stage my siblings claimed as their birthright. But I was there. Always there. It was his 55th birthday, an ostentatious affair held in a rented vineyard in Napa, draped in gold, marble, and arrogance. A string quartet played Vivaldi on a raised platform while staff in white gloves served aged Bordeaux and caviar on silver trays. I watched from the edge of the fountain, nursing my champagne like it owed me an apology. The number they liked to throw around was $70,000. That's what the party cost. For a man who already had everything, including the power to withhold affection like it was currency. My father, or the man I'd believed was my father, stood in the spotlight, tuxedo tailored to frame his arrogance, and gave a toast. "I'm proud of my kids," he said, lifting his glass high. Well, except for her. The laughter that followed wasn't the polite kind. It was sharp, jagged, the kind that drew blood. My stepmother smirked into her wine glass. My half-siblings didn't even blink. He meant me. I felt my spine straighten, the cold ripple of humiliation crawling up the back of my neck like a spider. But this time, I didn't look away. I stood up. Slowly. My heels echoed on the cobblestone as I walked to the center of the gathering. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single white envelope. My hands didn't shake. The envelope bore a simple label: DNA results, confidential. "Since we're celebrating truth tonight," I said, my voice slicing through the music, "I thought I'd bring a gift." His face twisted. First confusion. Then recognition. Then dread. I dropped the envelope in front of him. "You always said I was a mistake," I said. "But I'm not your mistake." I walked away before he could open it. Behind me, someone gasped. Then silence. Then the scream. It wasn't rage. It was realization. He had spent my entire life punishing me for not being enough, for not being him. But I was never his to punish. He had flaunted his Maybach in front of me for years like a trophy, so when I found out what I found out, I took it. I had paid for it anyway, through my silence, my obedience, my unwillingness to shatter the illusion. $150,000. Signed in my name. Registered with funds I'd funneled into the family trust while working behind the scenes of his empire, uncredited. I took back the car. I took back my name. I took back everything. And this is how it began. The next morning, headlines in our local society newsletter read like gossip dipped in champagne and shame. Billionaire's birthday bash ends in scandal. Daughter drops bombshell. I wasn't shocked. My father, Charles T. Everhart, wasn't just rich. He was curated, polished, packaged for consumption. CEO of Everhart Holdings, Philanthropist of the Year, speaker at endless economic forums. A man whose voice commanded boardrooms and broken hearts alike. And yet, he screamed like a man gutted by truth. My phone exploded that night. Half the calls were from my stepmother, Delia, demanding I correct the narrative. The other half were from people who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly remembering my number because scandal smells sweeter than roses in our world. I turned it off. Instead, I curled up on the stiff leather seat of the Maybach, the one I'd reclaimed not just out of revenge, but out of principle, and let the engine purr beneath me like a loyal creature that finally recognized its rightful owner. The truth is, I'd known for almost a year. It started with an insurance snafu. I was applying for a business policy for my startup, a boutique creative firm, branding, strategy, all the things my father said were cute hobbies unworthy of real investment. The application required medical information, so I ordered my full genetic profile for accuracy. I wasn't looking for drama, just due diligence. But the results unraveled me. 0 paternal match. Not a partial. Not a mutation. 0. I stared at the screen for hours that night, my chest so tight I thought I might burst through my own skin. I checked again. Then again. The numbers didn't lie. The man who mocked me in public, who refused to claim me in private, who always treated me like a stain on the silk of his legacy, he was right. I wasn't his, but that didn't make him innocent. It made him cruel. I waited, sat with the knowledge. I could have confronted him quietly, scheduled a meeting, asked for explanations. But no part of me wanted quiet. I had been quiet all my life. My silence had been his favorite currency, used to buy his comfort, pay off his shame, erase my pain. And then came the Maybach. He'd paraded it around the city like a medal. Told everyone it was a gift to himself. What no one knew was that I designed the Everhart logo that got his tech firm its big acquisition. Ghostwriting. Branding. The kind of work done in the shadows for men who take credit and toss scraps. I had never been paid properly, never even thanked. Just told, don't let it go to your head, Celeste. That car? It was registered under a holding company in my name. I'd set it up for tax purposes because his advisors said, she's quiet. She won't make trouble. But I'd already started to become someone different. Someone who didn't live in the folds of other people's power. And so, I waited for the perfect storm. And it came. I watched him open that envelope with the same entitlement he used to open bank statements and luxury invitations. Only this time, the numbers weren't working in his favor. 0% paternal probability. I didn't stay to see what he did next. I didn't need to. Because for once, the truth was loud enough. Growing up, I used to imagine that love was a ledger. You gave, you received. You earned your place. You got what you put in. But the Everhart house didn't operate on balance sheets of affection. There, love was a performance, and I was always the understudy, memorizing lines that were never meant for me. I was 8 when I first realized that Charles, my father, looked at me differently than he did my siblings. They were his pride, carbon copies of him with his straight jawlines and shark smile ambition. Even at that age, I knew I didn't match. Not in looks. Not in energy. I had his wife's eyes, but none of his mannerisms, and I carried a softness that clashed with his sharp world. Too sensitive, he'd mutter whenever I cried at movies or offered to share my toys. She'll grow out of it, Delia would assure him, pouring more wine than mothering. But I didn't grow out of it. I grew deeper into myself. Books became my refuge. Stories about girls who built kingdoms from ashes. I used to hide beneath my blankets at night with a flashlight and read until my eyelids fluttered. In those pages, I wasn't just the forgotten daughter, I was the heroine. I could build, change, reclaim. Still, I tried to earn his love the way I saw others do it. Awards, grades, perfect posture at charity events. I even learned to play the cello, not because I loved it, but because he once mentioned it was an instrument of class. I studied his expressions like blueprints, looking for ways in. But you can't break into a house that never had a door for you. When I turned 16, I received a pre-owned Honda and a pamphlet about responsibility. My brother turned 16 2 years later and got a brand new Tesla and a rooftop celebration at the W Hotel. My therapist would later call it symbolic neglect. But back then, I just called it Tuesday. When the DNA test revealed the truth, it didn't answer all the questions. In fact, it raised more. If Charles wasn't my father, who was? And more importantly, did my mother know? I didn't ask right away. Some truths need to steep. Others need to be laid bare with precision, not panic. And I needed time to gather the wreckage before I could sift through it. Instead, I dove into the only thing that had ever made me feel worthy, my work. My boutique branding agency, Salt and Bramble, was starting to gain traction. We weren't a household name yet, but our clients were loyal, our campaigns were clean, and I had a team that believed in my vision. It was mine, unstolen, unshared, unquestioned. But the moment I stepped out from the vineyard with that Maybach key fob in my purse, and the air humming with his scream behind me, I knew I could no longer live in two worlds. I was done with the polite half-life of pretending everything was fine. The DNA had burned the bridge for me. And I didn't look back to see if it still stood. 3 days passed in a haze. I stayed in a quiet rental cottage on the cliffs outside Sausalito, overlooking the Pacific. The Maybach sat parked in the gravel drive like a misplaced relic from a past I was now disentangling myself from. I watched the tides change, watched them pull back, gather strength, and return louder. It felt like a metaphor. The silence from my family was almost louder than the scream at the vineyard. No apology. No confrontation. Just a vacuum of words where fury should have been. But then came the envelope. No return address. No name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note in my mother's cursive. I told him years ago. He chose to stay. But he never forgave either of us. You were never the secret, Celeste. You were the sacrifice. I stared at the words for what felt like hours, as if rereading them might shift their meaning. But they didn't. They just etched themselves deeper into my understanding. So she knew. Of course she did. The man who raised me with disdain wasn't betrayed by circumstance. He was complicit in the lie. He chose to stay, not for love, but for image. For reputation. And he blamed me every day for his decision. My mother, she wrote those words with resignation, not remorse. There was no apology in the letter, only a quiet confession slipped under the door after the damage had already been done. And suddenly, I was back in our old living room, 16 again, listening to him say to Delia after I won the state art award, "She's good at making things look more valuable than they are." That was the ledger he kept. Not of money, but of worth. And I never broke even. But that week, my phone, once silent, began to vibrate again. Only this time, it wasn't family. It was media. Bloggers, local columnists, even a national tabloid reporter. They'd caught wind of the story, thanks to one particularly petty cousin who posted a video clip of my vineyard reveal on TikTok. It had over 2 million views in 48 hours. And just like that, the narrative began to shift. They didn't call me the black sheep anymore. They called me the heiress who took her name back. The brand strategist who played the ultimate long game. People didn't just want the gossip. They wanted me, my version of the story. I declined every interview. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I wanted to choose when. And how. And most importantly, why. Control wasn't something I was used to. But it felt like breathing fresh air for the first time. Meanwhile, I contacted my lawyer to dissolve the holding company I'd set up under my father's direction, the one tied to several of his investments, including the Maybach. Legally, it had been in my name. But my signature had been a formality in the early days, a puppet stamp on documents they didn't expect me to read. Now, I read every word. And I pulled every thread. By the end of the week, 3 luxury assets had been reclaimed, 2 shell accounts closed, and 1 silent investor removed from a real estate deal in Dubai. And none of it was illegal. Because you can't steal what was already yours. There's a moment, just before dawn, when the world holds its breath. The darkness hasn't quite lifted, but light is beginning to stretch across the edge of the sky. That's where I found myself in those days, standing in that hush between who I was and who I was becoming. Every morning, I sat by the cliff's edge with a thermos of strong coffee and a journal that had seen more of my soul than any person ever had. I didn't write for closure. I wrote to remember, to trace the pattern of silence, to name each thread of invisibility that had bound me for so long. But not all threads bind. Some become rope. And rope, when reclaimed, becomes a lifeline or a weapon. The first call came from a woman named Justine Monroe, the editor-in-chief of a digital magazine focused on women reclaiming power through entrepreneurship and survival. She wasn't interested in scandal. She wanted my story. The architecture of it. The design. How you build yourself inside a house that wants to pretend you don't exist. She said, "Celeste, we don't need you to name names. Just tell us how you stayed standing." I didn't answer right away. But something about the way she asked felt different. Not invasive. Not greedy. Just aware. That same afternoon, I drove the Maybach back into the city, not to flaunt it, but to close a chapter. I parked it outside my office building, took one last look at the car that symbolized both the lie and the leverage, then handed the keys to my attorney. "Sell it," I said. "Donate half to the women's shelter on 8th. The rest goes into expanding SALT and Bramble's scholarship fund." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" I nodded. It was never really mine. It was just borrowed vengeance. Letting it go felt cleaner than I expected. Because revenge, I'd come to learn, is satisfying, but it's not sustainable. You can't build a future out of spite. But you can build one from clarity. And I was finally clear. Later that evening, I sat down in my office, a modest space overlooking the marina, with glass walls and shelves lined with design books and award plaques I never bothered to display before, and I began to write. Not a manifesto. Not a tell-all. Just the truth, shaped like a map. The first line? I was not disowned. I was unclaimed. But I never belonged to them in the first place. I belong to myself now. I wrote for hours, stopping only when the sky turned indigo and the city lights blinked on like stars that remembered their worth. That piece became the foundation of something bigger, a series I would later publish anonymously, under the title The Unnamed Daughter. It resonated. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was familiar. Women wrote in from all over, daughters, sisters, wives, each with their own version of being the family footnote. And one message, buried between dozens, caught my breath. It read, "I know who your real father is. I think we should talk." It was unsigned. No number. No email. Just that single sentence. And just like that, the next chapter of my story began whispering its arrival. For hours, I stared at that message. The cursor blinked beneath it, an impatient pulse. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, frozen by all the weight that single sentence carried. "I know who your real father is. I think we should talk." There's a certain fragility in hope, especially when it's been withheld for so long. I wasn't sure whether to feel anger, curiosity, or fear. So I felt all three, layered like sediment. It was easier not to reply. Safer. But safety had never brought me peace. Only silence. I typed 2 words, "Where?" The response came 6 hours later. No name again. Just a location. A cafe in downtown San Francisco. 10 a.m. Sunday. That was it. I didn't tell anyone. Not my assistant. Not my lawyer. Not even myself, really. I simply got up that morning, dressed in neutral tones like armor, and went. The cafe was tucked between a bookstore and a boutique florist, one of those places with handwritten menus and antique brass light fixtures. It smelled like bergamot and old secrets. I spotted him immediately. He was seated by the window, back straight, fingers clasped around a porcelain cup. He didn't look wealthy or particularly remarkable. Just familiar. Something in the tilt of his jaw, the stillness of his posture. He stood as I approached, eyes searching mine as if confirming something unspoken. "Celeste?" he asked. I nodded. He extended his hand, then changed his mind and gestured to the seat instead. "I'm Henry. Henry Whitaker." The name didn't ring any bells. Not immediately. But the moment he said it, he reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph. Old. Faded at the corners. It showed my mother, Delia, on a beach, laughing. And beside her, a man who was not Charles. A younger version of the man in front of me. "I was with her the summer before she got married," he said quietly. "She never told me she was pregnant. I only found out by accident, years later. A mutual friend mentioned a child born that spring. By then, she'd already married Charles. And there was no place for me." I said nothing. He continued, his voice breaking in the softest place. "I thought maybe it was better not to interfere. But I've followed your life, from a distance. I watched you grow up in photographs, in whispers, in the background of society pages. I recognized your eyes. They were your mother's. But your stillness, that's mine." I could feel the earth shifting beneath my feet. Not violently. Just enough. He reached into his coat again and handed me another envelope, this one thinner than the DNA results, but heavier in implication. I did my own test. 2 months ago. I mailed you anonymously at first. I wasn't sure if you'd want this. My fingers trembled as I opened the seal. It was true. Another 0% next to Charles Everhard's name. And then, beneath it, another result. Henry Whitaker, 99.98% paternal match. There it was. The end of one myth. The beginning of another. Henry didn't ask for anything. He didn't cry. He just sat there, letting the silence stretch between us like something sacred. When I finally spoke, it came out softer than I expected. Why now? He met my gaze. Because I saw what he did to you. And I thought, maybe you deserve to hear the truth from someone who didn't want to control it. And for the first time in my life, I heard the word daughter without the echo of shamed. I didn't cry at the cafe. Not when Henry spoke, not when I read the report, not even when he placed his hand lightly on the table and said, I'm not trying to rewrite the past. Just hoping there's space for something new. But the moment I got home, I collapsed onto the hardwood floor of my living room, the photo of my mother on that beach pressed against my chest, and sobbed like the child I once was, aching for answers, for protection, for truth. The sound didn't echo. It soaked into the walls like it belonged there, finally. For so long, I had believed that if I were just a little smarter, a little more obedient, a little less me, maybe Charles would have seen me. Maybe Delia would have held me with something other than obligatory grace. But they couldn't. Not because I lacked value, but because they lacked space for anything that didn't fit their curated image. And now, suddenly, I belonged to someone else. To another story. To a man who didn't want to control the narrative, only to be part of it. The next few days passed in gentle fragments. I met Henry again. He showed me pictures of his life. His modest home in Oakland. His late wife. A garden he maintained with almost meditative care. I saw my reflection in the quiet parts of his life, the pieces that didn't need applause to feel whole. He never once asked what I planned to do with the information. He never even asked if I wanted to continue meeting. He just said, whatever you need from me, I'm here. And that, I realized, was the definition of fatherhood I had never known. Presence without possession. At work, things began to shift too. Salt and Bramble had grown in ways I hadn't anticipated. Clients were coming not just for our aesthetic sensibility, but for the story beneath it. They wanted the voice that had risen from a life of being overlooked. And I gave it to them. Not because I needed validation, but because I'd stopped hiding. In one branding meeting, a CEO of a women-led tech firm said, "You speak like someone who's been silenced." I replied, because I have. And I've made it my mission to help others reclaim their narrative. She hired us on the spot. Back in the shadows of my former life, the silence from Charles and Delia continued. No apology. No lawsuit, though I was prepared. Just a series of quiet disappearances. My name removed from family directories. My photo absent from charity gala yearbooks. It was as if I had been erased. But I wasn't empty. I was exhaled. I sold the last asset tied to my old family's name, a townhouse in Charleston that had been deeded to me on my 25th birthday, more as a PR move than a gift. The proceeds went to a scholarship fund under my grandmother's maiden name, the Aurelia Fund, for daughters raised in homes where love had to be earned with silence. I started receiving letters, handwritten ones, from girls who read The Unnamed Daughter. They told me about fathers who left, mothers who blamed, families who turned their absence into expectations. One girl wrote, "Thank you for saying what I've never had the words for. Thank you for being loud when I'm still whispering." And in that moment, I realized I had found the thread that held. It was never about revenge, or scandal, or even truth alone. It was about becoming the voice I once needed to hear. They say there are two types of people who grow up unseen, those who vanish into themselves and those who build empires from the invisibility. I had been both, first the ghost at the family table, then the architect of my own escape. But now I was something else. I was witness to my own becoming. The whispers of my old life hadn't faded completely. Occasionally, they surfaced like ripples, mentions of me at luncheons where old family friends tried to make sense of the scandal. Tragic, they'd say, swirling their wine. But she always was a bit sensitive. That word again. As if sensitivity were a stain rather than a strength. Meanwhile, my agency was thriving. Salt and Bramble expanded to a second office in Seattle, and I onboarded 2 new creative directors, both women who had walked their own long roads of quiet struggle. We didn't hire resumes. We hired resilience. One afternoon, while reviewing portfolios, a courier arrived with a package. No sender listed, but I knew the handwriting immediately. Delia. Inside was a box wrapped in plum tissue paper and a note written in her deliberate, practiced script. Celeste. I never told the truth because I thought it would shatter what little we had left. But you were never little. And you deserved more. I hope one day you'll understand. D. At the bottom of the box was a necklace. A simple gold chain with a tiny amethyst, the stone of intuition. I remembered it from childhood. She used to wear it on the days when she had meetings or court appearances, her power charm, she once joked. I didn't wear it, but I didn't throw it away either. I placed it on my bookshelf, beside my journal and the framed quote that had become my compass. Your silence will not protect you. Audre Lorde. Forgiveness is not something I give freely, not anymore. Not because I am bitter, but because I finally understand the value of my own boundaries. I don't hate Delia. I don't even pity her. I just know who she is. And knowing someone, truly, is more powerful than any illusion they could craft. 1 week later, Henry invited me to dinner. Not at a fancy restaurant. Just his place. Homemade lentil soup, warm bread, and jazz records playing softly in the background. His apartment was full of books, shelves of poetry and philosophy, and plant guides with handwritten notes in the margins. He was a man of roots, not flash. Over soup, he asked, "Do you ever miss them?" The Everharts. I didn't have to think long. I missed the version of them I tried to earn, I said. But not who they really were. He nodded slowly. That's grief. Not regret. After dinner, he gave me a small envelope. Inside was a deed to a small plot of land outside Napa. It's not much, he said, sheepish. But I thought, if you ever want to plant something that's yours, the metaphor wasn't lost on me. That weekend, I visited the land. Just an acre, bordered by oak trees and dappled with wild lavender. No structures. Just open air and possibility. I stood barefoot in the soil and felt something shift, not closure, not victory, but rooting. And in that moment, I decided I would build something here. Not for legacy. Not for show. But for myself. A studio. A sanctuary. A place where unnamed daughters could come and name themselves. I named the land the Wild Acre. It felt right. Untamed. Like the parts of myself I'd buried beneath politeness and perfection for most of my life. The studio began not as blueprints, but as sketches, soft pencil lines in my leather-bound journal, like whispers shaping into something real. It would be small, but deliberate. An open space with tall windows to catch the morning light, bookshelves carved into the walls, a gallery of quiet things, pressed wildflowers, handwritten letters, maybe a chair by the window where a woman could sit and breathe without having to explain herself. I didn't announce the project. I didn't invite the press or post filtered photos. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about reclamation. About making something with my hands, brick by quiet brick. In the meantime, Henry and I began a ritual. Sunday mornings. Coffee. No agenda. Sometimes we spoke about my mother. Sometimes not. Once, he brought an old box of letters she'd written to him during their brief summer together, notes folded with care, full of longing, guilt, and unfinished thoughts. She loved deeply, he said, but she feared loudly. I understood that kind of woman. A woman who built walls out of fear and called it duty. I had once been her shadow. I was learning to be her opposite. As construction on the studio began, I found myself pulled into more conversations, podcasts, panels, roundtables about narrative ownership, women in business, generational trauma. The media buzz from the Vineyard scandal had faded, but something else had grown in its place. People wanted to understand not the fall, but the flight that followed. One day, I received a letter, handwritten in a floral card. Celeste. I watched that video again. The one from the Vineyard. I used to see you as the quiet one in the family. I realize now that you were the only one listening. I'm sorry. For laughing. For not standing beside you. Isabel. My cousin. The same Isabel who once whispered gossip about me during family brunches, who followed Charles like a sycophant chasing scraps. And yet, this letter, it wasn't performative. It was clean. Honest. I didn't reply. Not because I hadn't forgiven her, but because I didn't need to perform that anymore either. Her apology was for her. And that was okay. But her words stayed with me. The only one listening. It reminded me of my childhood habit, sitting by the staircase, ear pressed against the railing while adults murmured in rooms they thought were soundproof. I had always been listening, always watching, not out of fear, but out of hope that one day, the silence would break. And now, I was building something out of that very listening. The Wild Acre was almost done. White walls, open beams, a glass ceiling over the northern corner for stargazing. The first event I planned was simple, a writing retreat for 5 women. No agenda. Just space. Journals provided. Phones off. Meals cooked with care. I invited women whose stories I had read through my inbox, names I didn't know, but whose pain had mirrored mine. The invitation read, "You don't need to earn your seat here. You already belong. Come. Bring your silence. We'll trade it for voice." The morning of the retreat, I arrived early. The air was still, dew clinging to the lavender like memory. Inside the Wild Acre, the walls breathed with a calm I hadn't felt in years. I laid out journals, each wrapped in linen, embossed with gold initials I'd matched to the guests. There were 5 of them. Adira, a nurse who had buried her voice beneath family duty. Jessie, a professor disowned by her parents when she came out at 22. Nina, who hadn't spoken to her sister in 14 years after an inheritance shattered their bond. Luz, who carried the weight of an immigrant mother's expectations like it was stitched into her spine. And Mira, a poet whose father never read a single one of her poems. They arrived quietly, each one hesitating at the threshold as if testing whether the stillness could hold them. It could. It did. We didn't introduce ourselves right away. Instead, we walked the land together, touched the bark of trees, sat by the oak bench carved with the words, "What was taken can be rebuilt." At dinner, we sat around a long wooden table and shared food made by hand, rosemary flatbread, butternut soup, honey-roasted carrots. Simple things, nourishing things. I didn't ask them to tell their stories. I asked, instead, "What silence do you still carry?" One by one, they answered. And in those answers, I heard echoes of my own past, the invisible threads of shame, sacrifice, survival. We weren't strangers. We were mirrors. That night, I slept beneath the stars on a cot near the window. I dreamt of a version of myself who never needed to prove her worth, who had been held gently from the start. When I woke, I wasn't sad. I was whole. Over the next 3 days, we built something beautiful. Not just in words, but in presence. We painted. We wrote. We cried into the dark and woke up lighter. And on the final evening, we lit a fire in the stone pit outside the studio. Each woman brought something to burn. A letter unsent. A photograph. A scribbled memory. I burned the plum tissue paper from Delia's necklace box. The note I'd held onto. I watched the flames curl it inward like a secret returning to ash. After the fire, as we stood barefoot in the dirt, Mira turned to me and said, "This place, it's not just a sanctuary. It's a reckoning." I smiled. Because she was right. The Wild Acre wasn't about healing in the soft way people romanticize. It was about truth. It was about saying, yes, I was broken. And yes, I rebuilt. And no, I don't owe anyone the silence of that story. When the women left, I gave them one final gift, a single black feather tied to a linen ribbon. Flight, I said. Not escape. Flight. They understood. That evening, I stood alone in the studio, the silence now sacred, not shameful. Outside, a hawk soared overhead, and in my chest, something rose with it. 2 weeks after the retreat, I received a letter in the mail. Thick envelope. Ivory paper. Hand-addressed in ink that tried too hard to be graceful. The Everhart crest. I didn't open it immediately. I poured tea. I sat by the window. I stared at the envelope like it was a ghost trying to pretend it was an invitation. Eventually, I slid it open with the brass letter opener I kept beside my journal, the one I'd bought in a second-hand shop in Vienna during a trip I'd taken alone, back when I still believed solitude meant invisibility. The letter inside was from Charles. For typed paragraphs. Precise. Formal. Unapologetic. He referenced the misunderstanding, the confusion caused by recent events, and the unfortunate exposure of private matters. Nowhere did he say the word daughter. Nowhere did he say sorry. Instead, he ended with a line that made my breath catch. Should you wish to clarify matters with the board or the press, I am open to discussing mutually beneficial statements. Mutually beneficial. Even in shame, he couldn't relinquish the script. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer I rarely opened, the one filled with relics of my former life, a childhood trophy I was told not to boast about, a designer invitation to a gala where my name was misspelled, a photo of our family posed like strangers dressed in pearls and pretense. I didn't respond to Charles, but I did draft a letter of my own, to the Boston Journal, the city's oldest publication and the one that had, for years, published glowing pieces about the Everhart family legacy. My letter wasn't vengeful. It was clear. I told them about growing up unclaimed inside a house that used my silence as scaffolding. About what it meant to discover the truth, not just about paternity, but about power. About building something real from the rubble. About the Wild Acre. The piece ran under the headline, Unclaimed, the daughter who rewrote her inheritance. It went viral. Not because it was scandalous, but because it was familiar. Women wrote in by the hundreds. So did men, fathers who hadn't known how to say I'm sorry, daughters who hadn't known how to stop waiting for that phrase. Even Justine Monroe reached out again. We're launching a new imprint, she said. Memoir. Real stories. Real names. I think yours should be the first. At first, I hesitated. The studio had always been my loudest statement. But the book, it would reach farther. It would travel into bedrooms, bus rides, lunch breaks, moments of doubt. So I said yes. I called it Threadbare. Because that's what I had been, worn, pulled thin, but never unraveled. The writing came quickly. The stories were already in me, etched into my skin, my silence, my resilience. I wrote about the night of the party, the scream, the car, the truth. But I also wrote about Henry, about Lavender, about the women at the retreat who showed me how to believe in new beginnings without needing to be reborn. When the manuscript was complete, I sent the dedication without fanfare. For every girl who sat at the table and was never served. We're eating now. Together. The first copy of Threadbare arrived in a brown package with a note from the publisher. You wrote a map. We're honored to walk it with you. I held the book in my hands for a long time before opening it. The cover was minimalist, linen gray with gold lettering, my name embossed like a scar that had finally healed. No photos. No blurbs. Just the title and the weight of what lived beneath it. I opened to the first page and read my own name, Celeste Whitaker. The first time it had ever appeared in print, not as a footnote, not as a pseudonym, but as me. I'd petitioned for the name change legally weeks before the book was finalized. Not in defiance, but in alignment. I'd carried the Everhart name like an anchor. Now I chose a name that floated. One that came from quiet truth, not loud performance. The launch party was held at the Wild Acre. I kept it small, intentional. No press, no velvet ropes. Just warmth, laughter, and the kind of music that fills a room without needing to raise its voice. The 5 women from the first retreat came. So did Henry, in his soft linen jacket and worn leather shoes, standing at the edge of the garden with a look of quiet pride that made my throat ache. Justine Monroe gave a short toast. In a world where so many women are told to be small, Celeste wrote a book that takes up space with grace. Not to dominate, but to dignify herself and us. I spoke only briefly. Some people are born with names that carry weight. Others of us must earn our own, through rupture, through reclamation, through rebuilding. This book is my name, and I'm no longer afraid to be known. We released paper lanterns that night. One for each chapter. One for each silence broken. They floated upward, soft embers in the sky. A few days later, the first reviews arrived. One critic wrote, "Threadbare is not just a memoir, it's a revolution stitched in sentences." Another said, "Celeste Whitaker doesn't shout her truth. She whispers it into your bones." Sales were strong. But what mattered more were the letters. From daughters writing to mothers who never asked what they dreamed of. From mothers who regretted choosing comfort over confrontation. From women in midlife who realized they'd never once been called brave, though they'd carried families, losses, and legacies on their backs. And then one morning, a different letter arrived. Handwritten. Careful. Familiar script. Delia. I hesitated, then opened it. Celeste. I read your book. Twice. I didn't recognize the girl in those pages at first. And then I did. She was the one I tried to silence, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. I don't ask for forgiveness. Just understanding. I was afraid of losing everything. What I didn't realize is that I lost you long before you walked away. D. I folded the letter and placed it inside the back cover of my book. Not to forget, but to remember how far I'd come. There are mornings now when I look in the mirror and do not flinch. That might sound like a small thing, but for women like me raised to question every reflection, to assess our worth through others' eyes, it is a revolution. I used to search the mirror for flaws, for reasons why I was unchosen. Now I meet my own gaze and see something steadier. Something earned. Threadbare made it onto the bestseller list within a month. But more than that, it started conversations. Book clubs, classrooms, therapy sessions. Women sent me photos of underlined passages. Daughters read it with mothers. Sisters reconnected after years of silence. It became more than my story. It became ours. One afternoon, as I sat at the edge of the studio's garden reviewing plans for the next Wild Acre retreat, my assistant, Roya, buzzed through on my phone. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "She says she doesn't have an appointment, but she's crying, and she has a copy of your book in her hands." I stepped outside. She was young, maybe 22. Freckles. Wrists wrapped in bracelets like armor. The book was clutched against her chest like a lifeline. I don't know what I expected," she stammered. "I just needed to see that this place was real." I invited her in. Made tea. We didn't talk much. She sat beside the window, staring at the hills, her eyes heavy with something I recognized. Before she left, she asked, "How did you stop needing them to say sorry?" I smiled, gently. I didn't stop needing it. I just stopped waiting for it. She exhaled like that had unlocked something, pressed the book into my hands, now signed and tear-stained, and whispered, "Thank you for surviving in a way that taught me how." After she left, I walked the garden barefoot. The earth was warm beneath my soles, the wind soft like breath on my shoulder. I stopped beneath the cedar tree we'd planted at the first retreat and traced the initials carved into the trunk, CW. Celeste Whitaker. I'd once imagined that reclaiming myself would feel like fire, but it felt like water. Cool. Quiet. Unstoppable. Later that night, Henry called. "Guess who showed up at my door today?" he asked. "Delia?" He chuckled softly. "No. Charles." My breath caught. What did he want? Closure, I think. Or absolution. Maybe just an audience. I didn't give him much. And did he mention me? No. But his eyes did. I didn't ask for more. Some truths unfold without needing to be witnessed. Others arrive in fragments. I had mine. That was enough. That evening, I wrote the first pages of my next book. Not a memoir this time. A novel. Fictional, yes, but threaded with the real. Its first line? She was born of silence, but learned how to turn it into song. Writing fiction was different. Liberating, but vulnerable in a new way. Memoir had demanded truth. Fiction required courage. Not just to imagine, but to trust that others would find themselves in a story born of shadows and shaped into light. The protagonist was a girl named Leora. She grew up in a house of mirrors, where every reflection lied just enough to confuse, but never enough to escape. Like me, she had been taught to perform rather than exist. Unlike me, she chose silence as her rebellion, not because she was afraid to speak, but because no one had ever taught her how to be heard. As I wrote Leora's story, I wrote parts of mine I'd never dared to say out loud. About the night I overheard Delia tell a friend, "Celeste is complicated." About the way Charles once introduced me to a business partner not as his daughter, but as Delia's girl. About the day I tried to run away at 13, suitcase packed with paperbacks and granola bars, only to sit on the front steps for 2 hours hoping someone would stop me. No one did. But writing Leora, I stopped her. I had someone find her. Listen. Believe. And maybe, in some quiet part of myself, I was rewriting the scene for me too. My publisher called to say pre-orders were already climbing. "Your name's becoming synonymous with reinvention," they said. But I wasn't reinventing. I was remembering. The woman I'd always been before shame, before silencing, before the labels, had simply been buried beneath other people's expectations. One morning, I received a package. No note. Just a worn paperback tucked into a manila envelope. The Secret Garden. My favorite as a child. Inside, the first page was underlined. At first, people refuse to believe that a strange new thing can be done. Then they begin to hope it can be done. Then they see it can be done. Then it is done, and all the world wonders why it was not done centuries ago. There was no signature. But I didn't need one. It was from my grandmother's collection. Delia must have found it. Her way of speaking, without voice. I pressed the book to my chest and allowed the ache in my throat to swell, not from pain, but from recognition. Sometimes the apologies we crave come too late. But sometimes, they come in the only language broken people have left. Meanwhile, the second Wild Acre retreat filled up within hours. This time, it would be 12 women. A full moon. 3 nights of writing, music, and garden rituals. One woman sent in a note with her application. "I don't even know what I'm asking for. I just want to stop pretending I'm fine." I knew that feeling. I built this place for her. The second Wild Acre retreat began with rain. Not the kind that ruins plans, but the kind that washes what no longer serves. It soaked the lavender, turned the soil dark and rich, and wrapped the studio in the hush of a cleansing. The women arrived in raincoats, boots, carrying umbrellas and baggage that couldn't be packed in luggage. Emotional, ancestral, unspoken. We welcomed each of them with a candle and a blank journal wrapped in cloth, one that matched no one else's. Each a private color, a private invitation. I told them what I always tell the women who come here. You don't have to become someone else. You just have to return to who you were before they told you to be quiet. The first night, we sat in a circle inside the studio, the windows fogged from the warmth of bodies gathered without performance. There were no icebreakers. No pressure. Only a question, softly spoken. "What's one truth you've never said aloud?" There was hesitation. Then a voice. "I never wanted to be a mother." Another followed. "I still mourn the life I never got to choose." I was loved more when I was silent. I don't know how to forgive the people I still love. Each truth felt like a stone placed gently on the earth, weighty, real, and holy. We did not comfort each other with platitudes. We bore witness. And sometimes, that's all a soul needs. Over the next 2 days, we wrote letters we'd never send. We crafted poems out of apologies we no longer owed. We walked barefoot through the lavender after the rain stopped, letting the mud touch us in ways no curated life ever had. I led a workshop called The Words We Swallowed. Each woman wrote a phrase she'd heard too often, something that wounded her but was said with a smile. You're too much. No one needs to hear all that. Why can't you just be happy? We wrote them on slips of paper, burned them in the fire pit at dusk. As flames kissed those words into ash, I saw shoulders loosen, jaws unclench, eyes brim but not break. This was not therapy. This was ceremony. On the final night, we performed the naming ritual, something new I had added to the retreat. Each woman stood alone in front of a mirror framed in gold leaf. She spoke the name she gave herself, not the one given by family or spouse or society, but the one she would choose if she were naming her own soul. I am fierce stillness. I am soft storm. I am daughter of return. No one judged. We only nodded, witnessing each other step into a self that had always been waiting. When it was my turn, I stood before the mirror, candle flickering at my feet, and said, I am Celeste Whitaker. Not claimed, not cast out, but risen. And in that moment, I felt it again. Not pride, not closure, but peace. The kind that comes not from being healed completely, but from knowing you no longer bleed in silence. After the second retreat, the land felt changed. Not in any physical way, but in vibration, in memory. It was as if the wild acre had learned to hold us, not just as visitors, but as voices. The soil had absorbed our stories like seeds, and I knew, even without flowers, they'd bloom in time. I returned to the city for a few weeks. There were book signings, interviews, and one particularly surreal panel discussion at a women's leadership summit, where I was seated between a tech CEO and a state senator. They spoke in polished, practiced rhythms, bullet points and slogans. When it was my turn, I simply said, my first act of leadership was walking away from the people who taught me to doubt my own voice. The room went still. Then it broke into applause, not polite, but eruptive. Afterward, a woman approached me. Late 50s. Elegant. Eyes rimmed with years. My daughter gave me your book, she said. I read it in one sitting. Then I cried for the way I raised her. For the way I was raised. She pressed a small card into my palm. On it, handwritten. Forgiveness isn't erasure. It's recognition with release. I kept that card in my wallet. Not as permission to forget, but as a reminder that even the most damaged lineage can offer us back pieces of ourselves, if only as a lesson. When I returned to the wild acre, Roya handed me a stack of mail. Among the envelopes was an invitation. Charles Everhart's 60th birthday gala. Black tie. Hotel ballroom. RSVP required. I stared at it for a long while. It wasn't a peace offering. It was a performance. Another show where every guest wore masks more costly than their gowns. I knew the type of night it would be: champagne, charity, curated small talk. I tossed the envelope into the fire that night. And in its place, I wrote 5 new invitations. But mine were different. Handwritten. Sealed with wax. Each addressed to a woman who had once written me a letter after reading Threadbare. Women who spoke of dreams abandoned, names lost, voices dimmed. I invited them to a special wild acre gathering. No gala. No gowns. Just a weekend of storytelling, soil, and self-reclamation. The RSVP was simple. If you're ready to be heard, not admired, come. We won't ask you to perform. Only to arrive. All 5 said yes. Not because they wanted escape, but because they were done hiding. That weekend, we didn't talk about healing. We embodied it. We painted on driftwood. Sang under the stars. Sat in silence until silence stopped being absence and became presence. And on the final night, as wind moved through the garden, one woman whispered, "I didn't know a place like this could exist outside of books." I smiled, because once I had been a girl who only lived in pages too. But now I was the author of my own story. And this chapter was mine. One morning, weeks after the gathering, I woke early. The sun hadn't yet broken through the trees, but the air was tinged with that golden hush that only comes in the hour before light. I stepped into the garden barefoot, feeling the earth's cool breath rise through the soles of my feet. The lavender had spread beyond its original bed. Wild, determined. It grew without asking permission. Like me, there was a time I would have trimmed it back, kept it neat, respectable. That version of me was taught that beauty should be contained. But now I let it sprawl, because the garden doesn't apologize for its reach. And neither do I. Inside the studio, on the desk beside the window, sat a letter I hadn't opened yet. Return address, Oakland. Henry. I unfolded the page with the reverence reserved for things that carry both past and possibility. Celeste. I keep a photo of you on my mantle now. Not the ones you've sent recently, polished and poised. But one I took of you years ago before you knew. Before either of us had language for this connection. You're seated on a bench at some gala, alone, head tilted to the side, watching everyone. Even then, you were the observer. And now, you're the architect. You're building something we were never given. I hope to visit the wild acre soon. I'd like to walk the garden you made from silence. Proud of you doesn't even begin to cover it. H. I pressed the letter to my chest and sat down, letting the words settle. It was a strange comfort to be seen so clearly by someone who hadn't been there for my childhood, yet knew me more intimately than those who were. That weekend, Henry came. He arrived with a basket of herbs from his garden, a bottle of red wine, and that soft smile of his that said, "No rush. No pressure. Just presence." We walked the land in quiet. He stopped by the cedar tree and placed his hand on its trunk. "She's strong," he said, "just like her planter." In the studio, I showed him the archives, journals from retreat guests, letters they'd left behind. He read a few with reverence, nodding slowly. "You're making something sacred here." "I'm trying," I whispered. "No," he said. "You're succeeding." Later, we sat by the fire pit under a sky stippled with stars. I asked him if he ever felt regret for the years we lost. He shook his head. "Not regret. Grief, maybe. But grief has a way of deepening love, if you let it." I thought of Delia then. Of Charles. Of all the years spent performing loyalty in a house built on image. I no longer ached for their approval. But sometimes, late at night, I still mourned the childhood I never got to have. The difference now? That grief no longer owned me. It shaped me, gave texture to my voice. As the fire crackled, Henry reached into his coat and handed me a small box. Inside was a ring, silver, simple, set with a tiny piece of moonstone. "It was your grandmother's," he said. "She wore it when she wrote. I think you should have it." I slid it onto my finger. It fit, as if it had always belonged there. Like so much else I'd only now begun to reclaim.